They laughed when she walked in with her mop. "Did the cleaning lady come to watch martial arts too?" A trainee mocked. Another joked, "Let her fight one round, this'll be fun." The dojo burst into laughter. No one took the woman in the faded hoodie seriously. But when Sarah Stone calmly dropped her canvas bag, stepped onto the mat, and took a stance that screamed military precision, the coach's smile vanished. He stood up slowly, his eyes no longer amused. Something told him this was no ordinary cleaner. They had just invited the janitor to fight the former lead instructor of Rapid Response Team Zero Delta. Sarah stood there, her worn sneakers planted on the edge of the mat, her hands loose by her sides. The laughter still echoed, bouncing off the dojo's polished wood walls. She didn't flinch. Her soft black hair fell over one shoulder and her eyes, calm, almost too calm, scanned the room. The crowd was a mix of students in crisp G's, their belts tied tight, and a few guests in designer workout gear, phones already out ready to capture the joke. Ethan, the black belt who'd called her out, was all smirks, bouncing on his toes like he was about to star in his own highlight reel. He was tall, lean, with a haircut that screamed money and a grin that said he'd never lost a sparring match. The room smelled faintly of sweat and pine cleaner, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows. Sarah set her mop against the wall, slow and deliberate, like she was placing a weapon in a rack. The crowd's laughter grew louder, but her face stayed steady like she'd heard it all before. A man in a sleek black jacket, his watch glinting under the lights, leaned against the wall, smirking. He nudged his buddy, another guy, in an expensive tracksuit and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Bet." She learned that stance from watching YouTube tutorials. His buddy laughed a sharp bark and added, "Yeah, probably mopped her way into a dojo once." Sarah's fingers tightened briefly on the handle of her bag, then relaxed. She didn't look their way. Instead, she adjusted her hoodie, pulling the sleeves down over her wrists. A small gesture that made her seem even smaller in the eyes of the crowd. The man in the jacket raised his phone, zooming in, his smirk growing wider. "This is going to go viral," he muttered. "Esnad." The air felt heavier, the laughter sharper, like needles pricking at her silence. Sarah's eyes flicked to the mat, then back to Ethan, her expression unreadable but steady like a lake before a storm. She stepped forward of her canvas bag, slung over one shoulder, the kind of bag you'd see at a thrift store, frayed at the straps. A woman in a bright pink sports bra leaned over to her friend, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is she seriously going to fight in that?" The friend, a guy with a man bun and a gold chain, snorted. "Bet she's never thrown a punch in her life." Sarah didn't look at them. She just slipped off her sandals one at a time and set them neatly by her bag. Her movements were precise, like she'd done this 1,000 times, but no one noticed. They were too busy laughing, too busy filming. Ethan cracked his knuckles loud, performative, and called out, "Don't worry, I'll go easy. Wouldn't want you to break a nail." The room roared again, and someone in the back yelled, "Mop lady's going to need a mop for herself after this." Sarah's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. She bowed slightly, her eyes locked on Ethan's, and said, "If permitted, I won't decline. Hey, before going, subscribe if this story finds you and tell me, where in the world are you watching from?" All right, let's get back to Sarah. The mat felt cool under Sarah's bare feet as she stepped into the sparring area. The crowd hushed a little more out of curiosity than respect. Ethan was already circling his stance wide, his fists up like he was posing for a photo. The head coach, Mr. Tanaka, stood at the edge of the mat, arms crossed. He was in his 60s, wiry with a face carved from years of discipline, and his eyes were fixed on Sarah. Not Ethan's Sarah. Something about the way she stood, legs slightly bent, shoulders relaxed, but ready made his jaw tighten. She dropped into a stance, her body angled just so her hands open but steady. It wasn't the stance of a dojo student. It was something else, something sharper like a blade held at rest. Ethan didn't notice. He was too busy playing to the crowd, winking at a girl holding her phone up. "All right, mop lady," he said. "Let's make this quick so you don't miss your floor shift." A teenage girl in the crowd, her guy slightly too big for her frame, giggled nervously and whispered to her mom, "She's going to get crushed, isn't she?" The mom, a woman with a tight bun and a purse that cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe, nodded smugly. "This is what happens when you step out of your lane," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Sarah's shoulders stayed loose, but her fingers curled slightly just for a moment before relaxing again. The girl's mom pulled out her phone, not to record but to text someone, her fingers flying as she muttered, "This is too good." The crowd's energy was electric now, feeding off the anticipation of Sarah's inevitable fall. Ethan's smirk widened and he bounced a little higher on his toes like a predator circling a lamb. Sarah's eyes never left him, her calm, a stark contrast to the room's feverish excitement. The timer buzzed and the room leaned in. Ethan moved fast, all confidence throwing a series of low kicks aimed at Sarah's shins. They were sharp, precise, meant to trip her up, make her stumble. The crowd jeered, phones flashing as they recorded. "Look at those shaky hands." A guy in a red guy shouted, "Can she even block?" Sarah didn't block. She didn't need to. Her feet slid across the mat, smooth as water, dodging each kick with the smallest of movements. Her hands stayed low, her eyes locked on Ethan's shoulders, reading every twitch. The crowd didn't see it, but Tanaka did. His arms uncrossed and he took a step closer, his brows knitting together. Ethan, frustrated, pushed harder, throwing a high roundhouse kick meant to intimidate. Sarah leaned back just enough, the air hissing as his foot missed her face by inches. Someone in the crowd yelled, "She hasn't even touched him yet." Ethan's smirk faltered just for a second. In the back of the room, a man in a tailored blazer, his hair slicked back, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He was a guest, not a regular, invited by one of the dojo's sponsors. He whispered to the woman next to him, "She's dodging like she's done this before. What's her deal?" The woman with a pearl necklace and a fake laugh rolled her eyes. "Probably just lucky. Janitors don't fight like that." The man didn't look convinced, his fingers tapping his knee as he watched Sarah move. Her evasions were too clean, too deliberate. He pulled out a notebook, jotting something down his pen, moving fast. Sarah's gaze flicked toward him for a split second, catching the motion, but she didn't react. The crowd was too caught up in Ethan's flashy moves to notice the quiet exchange. But the man's sudden focus added a new layer of tension, like a thread pulled tight. He came at her again faster this time, his ego bruised. The crowd was louder now, sensing blood. "Finish her, Ethan," a woman called, her voice dripping with glee. She was in her 20s, ritual-looking with a designer gym bag and nails that matched her lip gloss. Ethan nodded like he was taking orders and lunged with a downward elbow strike, the kind that could crack ribs if it landed. The room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. But Sarah moved fast, too fast. In one fluid motion, she pivoted her hips, turning like a dancer's, and swept Ethan's lead leg out from under him. He hit the mat hard, a grunt escaping his lips. Before he could roll away, Sarah was behind him, her arms sliding under his chin, locking in a rear, naked choke. The 3 seconds his hands slapped the mat, frantic. "Tap out!" The dojo went silent. The kind of silence that feels like a vacuum. Sarah released him and stood brushing her hands on her sweatpants. Ethan stayed down for a moment, gasping, his face red. The crowd didn't know what to do. Some clapped, some just stared, phones still raised but forgotten. Tanaka walked over his steps, deliberate, and stopped in front of Sarah. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Where did you train?" he asked. Not accusing, not mocking, just curious like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. Sarah met his gaze, her expression soft but unyielding. "Nowhere you'd know," she said, and turned to pick up her sandals. The crowd started murmuring, the spell broken. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his face a mix of anger and embarrassment. "That doesn't count." A red belt shouted from the side, his voice sharp with indignation. He was stocky, with a beard trimmed too perfectly. The kind of guy who bragged about his protein shake recipe. "She used a military move. This is sport, martial arts. No lethal techniques allowed." A woman in the crowd, her hair dyed platinum blonde and her earrings catching the light, clapped slowly, mockingly. "Nice trick," she called out, her voice laced with sarcasm. "What's next?" Pulling a knife. The crowd tittered, some nodding in agreement, their laughter a shield against the uncomfortable truth. Sarah's hand paused on her sandal strap, her fingers still for just a moment before continuing. She didn't look at the woman, didn't acknowledge the jab, but the air around her seemed to shift her silence louder than any retort. Tanaka's eyes flicked to the blonde, his expression hard, but he didn't speak. The assistant coach, a younger guy with glasses and a nervous habit of tugging his earlobe, leaned toward Tanaka and whispered, "Could she be former military?" Tanaka didn't answer, but his eyes never left Sarah. The dojo manager, a broad man in a tight polo shirt, stepped forward, his voice booming. "No one uploads that footage," he said, glaring at the crowd. "This stays in the room." A few people lowered their phones, but the whispers didn't stop. Sarah stood slinging her bag over her shoulder, ready to leave, but the red belt wasn't done. He stepped closer, his chest puffed out. "If you're so good, why are you mopping floors?" he asked, his tone mocking but curious, like he was daring her to prove something. The woman with the Bengal chimed in, her voice syrupy with fake concern. "Yeah, maybe she just borrowed that ID or something." The crowd laughed softer this time, but it still stung. Sarah paused, her hand resting on the strap of her bag. She reached down slow and deliberate and slipped her fingers into the side of her shoe. When she stood, she was holding a small silver card worn at the edges with a faint embossed insignia. She held it up just long enough for the light to catch it. "Ghost Hawk, Class 9, she said, her voice steady like she was reading a grocery list. The room froze again. An older man in the crowd, his guy worn but clean, his hands calloused from years of training, gasped softly. He'd been quiet all night, standing at the back watching. Now his eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open. He leaned toward the person next to him, a younger student with a buzz cut, and whispered, "Ghost talk. I heard about them in the service. They don't exist on paper." The younger student looked confused, but the older man's hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted his belt. Sarah's card disappeared back into her shoe, but the older man's reaction rippled through the crowd. A few students near him started whispering, their voices low, urgent. Sarah didn't seem to notice. She adjusted her bag and took a step toward the door, her movements as calm as ever. The red belt's bravado faltered, his eyes darting to the manager who was still staring at his phone, his face pale. Tanaka's eyes widened just for a moment before he schooled his expression. The assistant coach took a step back, his glasses slipping down his nose. A woman in the back, older with a GI that looked brand new, whispered to her friend Ghost Hawk. "That unit, it was erased from records. Is she one of the survivors?" The murmur started again, but they were different now. Less mocking, more uncertain. A few students near the front stood straighter, almost instinctively like soldiers at attention. Sarah slipped the card back into her shoe and turned to leave her steps, as quiet as when she'd entered. But the red belt blocked her path, his bravado fading but not gone. "We need to verify that," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "You can't just flash some card and expect us to believe you." A woman in a sleek yoga outfit, her hair pulled back with a velvet scrunchie, stepped forward, her arms crossed. "If she's some elite fighter, why is she hiding it?" she asked, her voice loud enough to draw eyes. "Sounds like a scam to me." Her friend, a guy with a sleeve tattoo and a smug grin, nodded. Asked it. "Yeah, real special forces don't mop floors for pocket change." Sarah's eyes flicked to them just for a second, and something in her gaze made the woman take a half step back, her confidence wavering. Sarah didn't speak. She just shifted her weight, her bag settling against her hip, and the room felt the weight of her silence. The manager's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it, his fingers tightening around the device. He didn't say anything, but his shoulders slumped like he had just been told something he couldn't argue with. The dojo manager, who had been watching silently, pulled out his phone and stepped away. His voice was low, but the room was quiet enough to hear snippets. "Yes, I need to confirm. Silverfist Dojo, Sarah Stone." He paused, listening, his face growing paler with every word from the other end. When he hung up, he looked at Sarah like he was seeing her for the first time. "She trained Unit 0 Delta," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let her go." The room didn't just freeze, it stopped breathing. Tanaka stepped forward, his movements slow, and bowed low, lower than he'd ever bowed to anyone in that dojo. "Sensei," he said, his voice thick with respect. "We apologize for not recognizing you." Sarah nodded just once and said, "I just came to clean the mats, literally and otherwise." She turned and walked toward the door, her bag swinging lightly against her hip. As Sarah reached the door, a young student, his face still flushed from training, called out, Wait, how'd you learn that chokehold? His voice was earnest, almost desperate, like he needed to know. The crowd turned, expecting Sarah to brush him off, but she paused her hand on the doorframe. She looked back, her eyes softening just a fraction. You don't learn it, she said, her voice quiet but firm. You earn it. The words hung in the air, and the student's jaw dropped slightly, his hands falling to his sides. The woman with the bangle opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Sarah's gaze swept the room one last time, and then she pushed the door open, the cool night air spilling in. The crowd was silent, their earlier mockery replaced by something heavier. Respect, maybe, or fear. The crowd parted for her, no one daring to speak, but the woman with the bangle couldn't help herself. If she's so elite, why is she cleaning floors? She muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Her friend, the guy with the gold chain, nodded. Playing humble doesn't make you special, he said under his breath. Sarah didn't turn back. She didn't need to. The air in the room had shifted like a storm had passed through and left everything different. Ethan, still rubbing his neck where her chokehold had been, stared at the floor. The red belt looked away as bravado gone. The manager's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it, his face tightening. Whatever he saw, he didn't share. Sarah reached the door, her hand on the handle, when a voice stopped her. It was a younger student, barely out of his teens, his GI still stiff with newness. Would you teach the beginner class? Please, he asked, his voice shaking. The room held its breath, waiting for Sarah's answer. A woman in the back, her face lined with years of hard work, stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. My son's in that class, she said, clutching a worn purse. He's been bullied at school. Could you teach him to stand up for himself? Her eyes were pleading, and the room turned to Sarah, the weight of their attention pressing down. Sarah's hand tightened on the door handle, then relaxed. She turned slightly, her face calm, but her eyes carrying a depth that silenced the room. I'll teach him to stand, she said. Not to fight. The woman nodded, tears welling up, and the crowd murmured, some in awe, some in shame. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped outside, leaving the dojo in a quiet that felt almost sacred. Sarah turned her eyes, softening for the first time that night. The room was watching, waiting. Another student, a woman with short hair and a nervous smile, spoke up. Maybe you could record some tutorials for us to learn from. Sarah looked at them, her gaze moving from face to face, taking in the crowd that had mocked her just minutes ago. I don't teach for fame, she said, her voice quiet but clear. I teach so you can survive. The words landed like stones in still water rippling out. The crowd bowed almost as one, their heads dipping low. Sarah didn't bow back. She just nodded a small gesture and walked out into the night. The next evening, as Sarah set up for the beginner class, a man in a crisp suit entered the dojo, his shoes clicking on the floor. He carried a briefcase, and his eyes scanned the room until they landed on Sarah. He approached, his voice low but firm. Ms. Stone, I represent someone who saw the footage before it was taken down. The students nearby froze, their warm-up stretches forgotten. Sarah didn't look up from adjusting a mat. No footage, she said. Simply her voice flat. The man hesitated, then pulled a letter from his briefcase sealed with a wax emblem. This is an invitation, he said, to consult on a sensitive training program. Sarah took the letter, glanced at it, then tucked it into her bag without a word. The students exchanged looks, their whispers starting again. But Sarah's focus remained on the mat, as if the man and his offer were just another speck of dust to sweep away. The dojo was never the same after that. The beginner evening class, once taught by a rotating roster of black belts, now had a single instructor. Sarah Stone, in her faded hoodie and worn sweatpants, stood at the front of the mat, her voice steady as she taught techniques no one dared to film. The red belt who'd mocked her was let go from his corporate job the next week. Something about a leaked video of him mouthing off at a client. The woman with the bangles stopped showing up, her Instagram suddenly private after someone posted a clip of her comments from that night. Ethan lost his sponsorship with a local gym chain. They didn't say why, but everyone knew. The consequences weren't loud or dramatic. They were just there like gravity pulling things back into balance. Sarah never spoke about that night. She didn't need to. The way she carried herself, quiet, unassuming, but with a weight that made people pause, said everything. Students started showing up early to her classes, hoping to catch a glimpse of the silver card she never showed again. The manager stopped scheduling her for late-night cleaning shifts. Instead, he asked her to review the dojo's training curriculum. She did without fanfare, her notes written in neat, precise handwriting. Tanaka started bowing to her every time they passed in the hall, a small gesture that carried years of respect. The students who'd laughed at her now listened when she spoke, their phones tucked away, their eyes wide. One evening, months later, a man walked into the dojo during Sarah's class. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen too much. He didn't introduce himself, didn't need to. The air changed when he entered, like the room itself knew who he was. The students froze mid-drill, their fists still raised. The man stood at the edge of the mat, watching Sarah as she corrected a student's stance, her voice calm, her hands gentle but firm. The woman with the short hair who'd asked for tutorials glanced at him and then away, her face pale. The guy with the gold chain who'd started attending classes again dropped his water bottle, the sound echoing in the silence. Sarah didn't look up. She just kept teaching her movements as steady as ever. A young boy in the class, no older than 10. His guide sloppily stared at the man, then at Sarah. He tugged at her sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. "Is that your husband?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah's hand paused mid-core erection, her fingers hovering over the boy's shoulder. She didn't answer, but the faintest smile touched her lips, gone as quickly as it came. The man's eyes softened just for a moment as he watched her. The students sensed it. The unspoken bond and their drills slowed their focus, shifting. Sarah's voice cut through the quiet, steady as ever. "Focus on your stance," she said, and the boy snapped back to attention. But the room felt different, heavier, like it was holding its breath for something bigger. The man waited until the class ended his presence, a quiet wait in the room. When the students filed out, bowing to Sarah as they left, he stepped forward. He didn't say much, just a few words low in private. Sarah nodded, her expression unchanged, but her hand paused on her bag just for a moment. The manager, who'd been hovering nearby, looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. Tanaka bowed to the man deeper than he'd bowed to Sarah, and then stepped back. The man put a hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gesture so brief it was almost invisible, and they walked out together. No one spoke. No one needed to. The room knew what his presence meant. Sarah wasn't just the janitor who'd silenced a black belt. She was someone who'd walked through fire and come out whole. The dojo closed for the night, the lights dimming one by one. The mats were clean, the air still. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to what had happened inside those walls. Sarah's students would talk about that night for years, their voices low, their stories growing sharper with each telling. But Sarah never told her own version. She didn't need to. Her silence, her presence, the way she moved through the world, it was enough for those who'd been judged, dismissed, or laughed at. Her story wasn't just a story. It was proof. Proof that you could stand in a room full of doubters and walk out with your head high. Proof that the truth catches up slow but sure. Proof that you were never as small as they thought. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.